All right, we are ready. If y'all are ready, appreciate you guys being online with us, and as always, I appreciate you all being here tonight. Turn to Romans chapter 11, and we got about halfway through. We'll finish it up, and maybe go into chapter 12, but we'll at least get through chapter 11. Let me see what's going on with this. Okay, chapter 11. Let's start back around in verse 11. We started the first probably 12, 13 verses last week. But I want to back up to about verse 11 and just kind of review just for a minute. Remember, the whole chapter is, Paul's been telling about the Jews thinking they're superior. And he said, because you guys think you're superior, you're not. Nothing you have inherently as a Jew makes you worthy. Gentile Jews, all the same thing. You're all lost and condemned before God. You need Jesus. And so he's been laying out this argument out for him. Now he gets into chapter 11, and his whole way of thinking is, because he knows what they're thinking, and that is Israel banished forever? Is Israel doomed? And he says, no, they're not doomed. There's a faithful remnant of Jews that are still believers, and they're going to be reunited or united in with the believing Gentiles eventually. So he gives us this little kind of a little diatribe on these branches, and he says Israel as a whole was a bad branch, a bad tree, but this good tree of believing Gentiles were grafted into it, and then as a result, then the branches of Israel will be grafted back into the tree that the Gentiles are growing. So he basically says, you guys temporarily set aside. Now he's going to deal with the Gentile people. And one of the results, or one of the things that God is trying to get out of this, is the Jews are going to be jealous and get envious of what the Gentiles have. And so Paul said one of the benefits of this is once the Jews see what is going on with the Gentiles, they're going to want the same thing. And so that's how he's laying out chapter 11. In chapter 11, or verse 11, he says, I say then, did they not stumble as to fall? In Greek, it's the same, it's both are words for fall, but there's two different words, two different ways that he uses it. One is the first fall, remember, is completely falling down, falling prostrate to the ground, you just fall completely over. The second is you stumble. And so Paul says, because he uses both words in the same sentence, and he says, Israel stumbled. They didn't completely fall. They're completely done away with. They just stumbled a little bit. God sent them the Messiah. They rejected him. And so they stumbled over that. But God's going to pick them back up. It's kind of like if, and I always try to explain it like this. To me, this is the way I interpret Scripture, eschatology, the last days. It's kind of like history is moving along in this straight line, and then all of a sudden in this straight line there is a radical thing that happened with the birth of Jesus. And Jesus is born, Jesus lived, Jesus died, and the Jews rejected. And so what happens after Jesus dies is there's this church age that continues on this vertical line. So, or it's horizontal line. So you're watching this line of history fold out, and it's all the church age, from Jesus on to where we're at right now. And then at some point in the future, there's going to be a split in that line again that's going to be the rapture. And this part of history is going to be over. Jesus is going to pull the church up, the believing church now. He's going to pull us up in the rapture. The Greek word is harpazo, to be snatched away or caught up. We'll all be caught up with him in the clouds. And then as this line diverges and there's this rapture, it's just almost like God takes the Jews out of this box that they've been placed in, and he's going to put them back in the timeline for 7 years during that tribulation. And during the tribulation, he's going to do all these things specifically for their benefit. We call it the tribulation, those sealed judgments and all that. The witnesses will come, and the Antichrist and false prophet and all that stuff. At the end of that 7 years, then there's going to be a millennial reign. Jesus is going to come back with all of us, all the believing people that died during the tribulation as martyrs, that died in our age, in the past. We'll all come back with him, rule and reign for 1,000 years. At the end of the 1,000 years, God will usher in the new heaven, new earth, and we'll enter in what we call the eternal state. That's, we call it heaven. This is the time period Paul is really talking about. He said, especially verses 28 through 32 in chapter 11, it's all millennial reign. So Paul is basically saying, Jesus died for you. You didn't believe it. You stumbled over that truth. You couldn't grasp who Jesus was. And so here's what God did. God temporarily put you guys aside. He's not done with you. You didn't completely fall out of favor. God is not done with you forever. He just temporarily set you aside. Now he's dealing with the Gentiles. And one of the hopes is that as Gentiles are being saved and the church is growing, the Jews will look at what God is doing and become envious of that and say, that's what we missed out on, that's what we need. That's kind of what Paul is telling them in chapter 11. It really hasn't happened yet. But it does not mean that it won't. As a matter of fact, God says specifically that it will. And so then Paul says in verses 12, 13, 14, basically if a few Jews make such an impact on the Gentiles, what do you think would happen if all the Jews started believing? What if it's a revival? All right, so now we jump down to about let's look at verse 16. We'll start in verse 16, chapter 11, verse 16, because I think this is kind of where we kind of started wrapping it up. But Paul says, if the first piece of dough is holy, the lump is also. And if the root is holy, the branches are also. He's talking about this first fruit idea. And what he's saying is, the first fruit represents Abraham as father to us all. Not just father to the Jews, but he's to all of Israel. Them nationally, physically, and spiritually, us spiritually. But Abraham's faithfulness is the same, this same faithfulness. He's talking about this lump. He says it's the same faithfulness that's going to be manifested now to all of Israel. In other words, there's still this remnant of believers. They still have this same faithfulness. Then he goes to verse 17, and he said, but if some of the branches were broken off, and you being a wild olive were grafted in among them and became partaker with them of the rich root of the olive tree. In other words, all of Israel did not reject Jesus. The good branch will produce fruit. Not all of them are bad branches. The good branch will produce fruit. The wild branch of Gentiles is now grafted to the good root of Israel, because it's the fruit that's produced of the root, not really the branch. And so he's saying there's this root in Abraham, and the faithfulness that Abraham had came to some Jews, because some of them have that same faithfulness. And he says, most of your bad branches, you didn't believe, so you're unfaithful. But those good branches, God used that to reach out to the Gentiles. And now the Gentiles are going to be grafted in, and so they're coming into what God already established, and he says that's the way of it. Then he's going to turn around and say, then all those bad branches of Israel, they're going to have a chance to be grafted in to the new tree that's being grown with the faithful Jews and the Gentiles. They come together to form the church, and it's growing and succeeding. And those bad branches are going to now have a chance to be grafted in to that good tree. In other words, I'm not done with you yet. I've temporarily set you aside, but I'm not completely finished with you. That's what he's trying to say. Now, verse 18. I think this is actually where we did leave off. Do not be arrogant toward the branches. But if you are arrogant, remember that it is not you who supports the root, but the root supports you. He's switching. He's talking to the Jews. Now he's talking to Gentiles. And here's what he says to the Gentiles. Don't assume a superior attitude just because you're being grafted in. I came to the Jews. They rejected. I reached out to you. Just because now I reached out to you, don't think you're better than the Jews. So it's a warning. Verse 18 is a warning. It's a warning to Gentiles not to have a superior attitude. Verse 19. And this is a ridiculous statement. It's really kind of like hyperbole. He said, you will say then, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. And I don't know if you get the kind of the fullness of that, but I'm not saying it's a joke, but it's a weird statement. It's a ludicrous statement. He's saying to the Gentiles, don't get this feeling of superiority. And he says, because you're going to say, I know how you think, you're going to say that God did what he did to the Jews on purpose, broke them off, just so that he could reach out to you. And Paul says, that's not right. That's not true. He didn't do that till they did it to themselves by their unbelief. So don't get this attitude where God says, okay, I'm looking down at everything, and I see all these Gentile people that are unbelievers. I love them more than Jews. So I'm going to send my salvation to the Jews. I'm going to send the Messiah to the Jews, but I'm going to force them to reject it just so I can reach out to the Gentiles who I love better. Paul said, don't get that attitude. That's not right. That's not what God did at all. Now, verse 20. Verse 20 explains verse 19. So look how he explains. There's three things that he says in here, or actually really two, that he says to explain it. He says, quite right. They were broken off for their unbelief. But you stand by your faith. Do not be conceited, but fear. And so he says there's two things here to explain this. Number one, Israel had sinned as a nation. He said they're broken off because of their unbelief. They sinned. They had unbelief. That's why they were broken off. It's not, God didn't do it just so that he could come to you. That they did it because of their unbelief. And then the second thing he says in verse 20 is, as a result, they're broken off. And it's not God's way of providing room for the Gentile. It's actually God's punishment for sin. And so Paul said, don't get this out of whack. God didn't specifically do this to the Jewish people. He offered them Jesus, but they rejected him because of their sin and unbelief. And so the result of that is God reached out to the Gentile, but he didn't do it as a way to provide for the Gentiles, even though that's what happened. He did it primarily as punishment for their sin. They sinned, they had unbelief, so God set them aside. He temporarily stopped dealing with them because they didn't believe in the Messiah. The result of that is beneficial to me and you. As a result of their unbelief, you and I got a chance to believe. He didn't do it just for us, even though that's a result, if that makes any sense. He did it to punish them. We just happen to have the byproduct of it. It's kind of like, let's say this. Let's say that you're a parent, you got two kids, and they're eating dinner. And you got them at dinner, and they both have a bowl of pudding for dessert. And you say to your two kids, you got to finish all your food, and you got to behave at the table, then you can have dessert. One kid is superb. He does good. He's minding his own business. He's eating his food. He's behaving. He's minding his manner. And his second kid is just unruly. He's throwing his plate, flipping his food. And so the parent says to the unruly kid, go to your room without dessert. And his first kid says, what about that pudding? And the mama says, well, you can have it, baby, because you've been good. And so the second kid gets the pudding. It's not that the mama just punished the first kid just so the second kid could get second pudding. It's that the result of the first kid getting punished fell into the second kid's lap. That's what Paul says happened between the Jews and the Gentiles. It just kind of happened. All right? It wasn't really, and I hate to say it wasn't God's plan, because God knows everything. God's omnipotent. But it's just the way it worked out. God knew it was going to work out that way, but he didn't. That wasn't the primary cause of it. Now look at verse 21, because he's going to complete verse 20. Takes him a while. Verse 21, for if God did not spare the natural branches, he will not spare you either. And so this just completes the warning of verse 20. And here's really what it's saying. And I can boil verse 21 down into three words. God hates sin. That's really what it's talking about. God hates sin. And because God hates sin, it says, look at the way he words this. If God did not spare. When he used the word spare, it really means, it translates to tenderly forbear. To tenderly have patience with. And he says, God didn't do that. And so here's what he's saying. Because he's talking to Gentiles. And he says, if God didn't save or didn't have patience with the natural branch, and in this case the natural branch is Israel, the secondary, the unnatural branch, I guess, the Gentile. And so he says, if God didn't spare national Israel, what makes you think he's going to spare you? If God punished their sin, why do you think you can get away with it? You're not going to. And so that's really his message to the Gentiles. It's a warning. Now, verse 22 gives us two sides of God's character. Look at verse 22. Behold then the kindness and severity of God. To those who fail, severity, but to you God's kindness. If you continue in his kindness, otherwise you also will be cut off. So it says there's two sides to God here. First, God's goodness. Second, his severity. And he said because of his severity, that characteristic of God, he hates sin, he punishes sin. God judged Israel. He set them aside. Because of God's goodness, he extended the offer to you. And so it's the same God, two characteristics, two sides of God's character. Verse 23, it's a biblical prophecy. And they say also, and they also, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. It's a prophecy. This is a millennial prophecy. It's an eschatological prophecy. And so in verse 23, what he says is, and really, let me see if I can explain it like this. In Greek, it's a future indicative passive, which means they should be grafted in, which means it's God's plan for them. And so here's what he says about Israel. You guys were the natural branch, but you had unbelief. And so you got cut off. And then he says, but they should be grafted in again. Even though they're cut off, he didn't throw them in the fire and burn them up and has done away with them. They're just set aside. And he says they should be, in the future, grafted back into what God is already doing in the church. But look how he words it. If they stop their unbelief. If they do this, God says, I'll do that. If they stop their unbelief. If they believe. And because in a minute I'm going to read you a verse that you're going to say, well, it sounds like universalism, like God is just going to save all the Jews. He's not. He's talking about national Israel. The Jewish people are going to be saved the same way we are, by faith in Jesus, by their trust in him. And so here he says, these Jews are unbelieving. I cut them off. They didn't believe. But I'm not done with them. I'm going to give them a second chance to believe. And if they believe again in the future, they'll be grafted back in. I'll bring them in too. But I'm going to give them a chance to do just what you did. You have to believe. All right, so that's a prophecy. It's a millennial prophecy. Verse 24. For if you were cut off from what is by nature a wild olive tree and were grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will those who are the natural branches be grafted into their own olive tree? This is assurance of the Jews. Paul speaking of the Jews as a good olive tree and the Gentiles as a wild olive tree. Olive trees are used for ornamental purposes. And he says in verse 24, if the wild ones are cut off, and the good ones are the good ones are cut off, the wild ones are grafted in, the good ones can be grafted in again. All right? It's just assurance for the Jews. Now, verse 25. Verse 25 is actually the most important of this, because verse 25 through verse 32 really is the future assurance of Israel. And to start in verse 25, you have to understand the paragraph in the context that Paul was talking. Paul had a specific thing that he was trying to do in this paragraph. And the larger context is he's talking about Israel as a nation. He's not talking about individual Jews. So when we read starting in verse 25, it's a national prophecy. It's because it's going to sound like that all Jews are guaranteed to be saved. That's not true. He's talking about a restoration of Israel like Ezekiel did. Ezekiel said, God's not done with you yet. Starting in chapter 33 of Ezekiel, he said there's a future time when God will deal with Israel again. Paul's saying the same thing. It's a future thing. And so look at verse 25. For I do not want you, brethren, to be uninformed of this mystery. He's talking about a mystery. A mystery in the Bible Because there's several things in verse 25. A mystery in the Bible always means something. It doesn't mean something we can't ever figure out. It means something that was previously hidden but is now revealed by God. That's what a mystery is. And so Paul said, I don't want you to be ignorant of this mystery. I don't want you to be ignorant of it. I don't want you to be uninformed of it. It's Paul's way of saying there's something really important going on, and I don't want you to miss it. Anytime his writing is very unique to this. Anytime Paul writes, for I do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, like in 2 Thessalonians when he talks about the rapture. What he's saying is, I want you to get this. Slow down and get it. And you'll notice this, and go home and go home and Google every time Paul says, for I would not have you ignorant, and then watch the word that follows it. The same word always comes after it. It's in Greek, it's adelphos, it's brothers. He always says, I don't want you to be ignorant, brothers. In other words, talking to you, my brothers. And I don't want you to miss this. There's something important that I'm about to tell you. And so look at verse 25. Here's what he says. He's setting up this future thing for Israel. I do not want you, brethren, to be uninformed of this mystery, so that you will not be wise in your own estimation, that a partial hardening has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And so he's talking about this future restoration of Israel. He's talking about something that's going to happen in the future. But look what it says in verse 25. There's a partial hardening, not a full. It's not a full fall. It's a partial stumble. There's a partial hardening of Israel. Israel is temporarily set aside until, God tells us when, till the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. Israel is temporarily set aside. There's a partial hardening of Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles. When's the fullness of the Gentiles? No clue. Here's what God means by it. There's a specific number in God's mind. God knows when that number is going to be up. I think that he means there's going to be a sweeping revival among the Gentiles. I think we're going to see one more big great awakening, one more big revival. And I think he means, which is kind of happening today, universal evangelization, getting the gospel everywhere. I think that's really what Paul is alluding to. He says God is going to harden Israel temporarily, set them aside temporarily, until this number of the Gentiles is fulfilled. When's that number going to happen? God knows the number. We don't know the number. But it's going to happen when there's this great revival among the Gentiles and there's universal evangelization. We've had several great awakenings in U.S. history, world history really. But I think there may be another one. And I think that it has to do with this universal appeal of the gospel. Get the gospel everywhere. That's why being a Southern Baptist is so important in my opinion, because we're doing all we can to get the gospel all over the world. All these people groups that are out there. Do you know there's still like 4,600 people groups in the world where there's no missionary that's been, no language, no Bible in their language they hadn't heard. So there's still people out there that don't know. And God has this number in mind. When we get to this number, that's going to be it. And look at verse 25. Here's the implication of it. Israel's temporarily set aside until this particular day that God has in mind, or a particular number he has in mind. And when that number happens, then we combine Daniel and Romans and Revelation. And when that number happens, the rapture will take place. And God will pull the church up. He'll say, the number of the Gentiles has been fulfilled. Everybody's going to be saved, been saved. You know, the rest of them, their hearts are hardened. They're not going to accept. And so I'm pulling the church out, taking the church out. He'll take the church out. And then this partial hardening of the Jews will end. And then God will put them back into play and start dealing with them as a nation again. We're not talking about, and we're not talking about individual Jews per se, but we're talking about Israel as a whole. The nation as a whole is what he's talking about. but the nation includes the people. All right, so look at verse 26. Because 26 is the beginning of all this. 26. And so all Israel will be saved, just as it is written. I told you, that's that phrase that people take that and say, well, there you go, every Jew in the world is going to be saved. He's talking about national Israel. And what he's talking about is Israel, the country of Israel, will be restored. Ezekiel said the same thing, Jeremiah said the same thing, Isaiah said the same thing. As a matter of fact, when Paul writes this in verse 26, he appeals to those Old Testament prophets. He quotes them. Remember, it's all caps. Anytime you see in the New Testament all caps, that's a direct quotation from the Old Testament. And so he says, so all of Israel will be saved, just as it is written. Where is it written? In the Old Testament. It's a quote from Isaiah 27:9. It's also a quote from Jeremiah 31:34. They're really similar to say the same thing. But he's not talking about that every Jewish person in the world will come to know Jesus. He's talking about a time when God is going to forgive national Israel and give them a chance of repentance again. That's what he's talking about. And you have to, when you look at verses like this, we always say in seminary, they always teach you, let Scripture interpret itself. Scripture will interpret Scripture. You can't just pull verses out and say, well, this means this. So we look at Daniel, we look at Ezekiel, we look at Jeremiah, we look at Isaiah, we look at Zechariah, we look at Revelation. And when you piece together the whole pericope of what's going on, he's talking about national Israel. And what he's saying is there's going to come a day when God restores Israel and gives them another chance and deals with them eschatologically. All right? So that's why he quotes specifically here Isaiah and Jeremiah. And here's the quote. The deliverer will come from Zion. He will remove ungodliness from Jacob. This is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. This restoration of Israel. Not every individual Jew will be saved, but Israel as a nation will be brought back into fellowship with God. Yeah, I mean, you realize that now. I'm not anti-Semitic by no means. I think the Jewish people are our best friends, and always will be, always should be. Us in Israel ought to be just like this all the time. But right now, Israel's not in fellowship with God. The nation of Israel, they've turned their back on God. They're jumping at the chance to redo sacrifices. If somebody said, hey, let's remove this mosque and build a temple here, they'd be all over bringing sacrifices back. That's what they're waiting on. They're out of fellowship with God because they don't recognize the Messiah. And so you've got God sending the Messiah to the Jews. They rejected it, so they're out of fellowship because they reject Jesus. Then you got Gentiles over here who God said, I'm going to give you the opportunity now. And Gentiles by the droves are being saved because they're accepting the Messiah. Some don't. Some Jews believe. And some Jews say, yeah, I believe that. And we call them Messianic Jews. They're Jews who believe the Messiah. And they're basically Christians. And then there are some Gentiles who don't believe. There's some believers. But here's Paul is saying, there's going to come a time in the future when God is going to put Israel back in right fellowship. The country of Israel. And God is going to give them another offer or another chance to receive the Messiah. And the covenant, look what he says in verse 27. This is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. In this case, you know what he's talking about, a covenant? He's going to restore their sight spiritually. Right now they're spiritually blind. So God's covenant with them is, one day I'm going to open your eyes. One day you're going to see again. And you're going to see the Messiah for who he is. Then you jump down to verse 28. From the standpoint of the gospel, just the gospel, the death, the burial, the resurrection of Jesus. From the standpoint of the gospel, they are enemies for your sake. But from the standpoint of God's choice, they are beloved for the sake of the fathers. So verse 28, the Jews were and still are enemies of the gospel. the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus. They do not stand in alignment with that. They do not believe that. But he says, if they had not been enemies, then look how he words this in verse 28 and see if it makes sense. From the standpoint of the gospel, they're enemies for your sake. He's talking to Gentiles. They're enemies for your sake. They're against the gospel. But from the standpoint of God's choice, they are beloved for the sake of the fathers. Here's really what he's saying. It's hard to swallow. But he said the Jews were, have always been, still are enemies of the gospel. But if they had not been, then God's plan for the Gentiles wouldn't have come to fruition like this. Wouldn't have happened. You and I might be out of luck. That's really what he's saying. He said they're enemies of the gospel for your sake. You better be grateful that they rejected. Because since they rejected, offered it to you. If they had accepted, might not have offered it to you. You and I might have grew up in pagan cultures where the Jewish faith, true Israel, Christian Jews, would have just went all over the globe, and you and I would have had to convert to that, or be pagans. God said, because they were enemies of the gospel, it worked out for you. It's for your sake. All right, that's what he means in verse 28. Now look at verse 29. Because from verse 28 to verse 32, it's all millennial. We're talking about what's yet our future. Verse 29 then. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. For just as you once were disobedient to God, but now have been shown mercy because of their disobedience. It's a statement of finality. Look at verse 29. The gifts of the calling of God are irrevocable. It's final. Don't get them back. So he says this irrevocable nature of the gift that God has given you is a testament to God's changelessness. He does not change. Psalm says there's no variableness in him. You know, he's the same. Or James. It is what it is. Verse 30, for just as you once were disobedient to God, but now have been shown mercy because of their disobedience. This is a reminder to the Gentiles, to the saved Gentiles, to the Christians. It's a reminder to them that this saved Gentile was once disobedient too. He wasn't always a Christian. He used to be disobedient. And because he was disobedient, he was as disobedient as any Jew in Israel. He says that they're disobedient. So we can't be, this is really a good verse for why we can't be anti-Semitic. Because we tend to look at like the crucifixion of Jesus and blame Jews. Well, them Jews killed Jesus. They had no difference. If you and I had been there, we'd probably done the same thing. You can't, because we're grafted in, we're saved now. Before, we were just as disobedient as the Jews. We just made a right choice. But that disobedience was still in our heart, was still the same way. So again, he's warning the Gentiles, you're not better than anybody really. And then verse 31, so these also have been disobedient, that because of the mercy shown to you, they also may be now shown mercy. Again, another warning for Gentiles. And he's saying there's a universal, really, I guess, a nature of sin. It's all innate within us. And God rejects it. Okay, words, verse 31. So these also now have been disobedient, that because of the mercy shown to you, they also may now be shown mercy. Verse 32, for God has shut up all in disobedience so that he may show mercy to all. We're all disobedient. There's a sin nature in all of us. And God rejects that sin nature. He doesn't mesh with our sin nature, that they don't coexist. And he says to the Gentiles, you guys were once like that. Then in verse 32, he says, this is the full intent of God to the Jews and the Gentiles. This is for all of you. This is God's intent. Look at what he says in verse 32. For God has shut up all in disobedience. That's his intent. Why did he do that? So that he could show mercy to all. That's God's intent. That's his ultimate intent. In other words, here's the beauty of it. And Paul's already told them this in Romans chapter 6. But here's what he's trying to say. Because you and I as Gentiles were sinners. And because the Jews were sinners. Because all God's people are sinners. Then God has an opportunity now to show grace to all of us. It's the same grace. The Jews are over here in sin. The Gentiles are over here in sin. And because we're all sinners, God can show his grace to all. Jew and Gentile the same. We're all the same at the foot of the cross. We're all sinners in need of God's grace. And so now, verse 33, Paul gets excited. Look what he said. It's almost, verse 33 is almost like a doxology. He's given all this theological stuff, and then it's like, he just gets really excited. Listen to what he said. Oh, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God, how unsearchable are his judgments and unfathomable his ways. That's a praise. I'm giving you all this theology, all this stuff. And then it's like Paul said, wait a minute, now I'm thinking about all I'm saying to you about God's grace and how he extends it to us because we're sinners. And he says, man, this is exciting to me. God is so wise. God is so limitless. God is so unchangeable. God is all these things. And Paul says, that makes me excited. His ways are unsearchable. We don't know what God is doing. And because God is so much higher than us, Paul said, that excites me, that God is God and we're not. And then he goes back to the theology. Verse 34, for who has known the mind of the Lord, or who became his counselor, or who was first given to him that it might be paid back to him again? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be the glory forever. Amen. Verse 34, you notice that verse 34 and 35 are all caps. That's an Old Testament quote. That's Isaiah. As a matter of fact, it's Isaiah chapter 40, verse 13. And it's a praise of God against the doxology. Who can know the mind of God? We can't know God. And in verse 36, again, it's a proclamation of God's positions. Look what he says about God in verse 36. Of him, God created all things. That's what he means. God created everything. And then he says, through him, God regulates all things. He sustains all things. And then he says, unto him, all things have to conclude with God. So God made all things. God sustains all things. And then God concludes all things. It's millennial. He made it. He's watching over it. We don't know his ways. We don't know why he deals with Jews the way he does. We don't know why he deals with Gentiles the way he does. We don't know why God wants to end things the way he does. We don't know any of that stuff. His ways are unsearchable to us. But Paul says it's exciting to me because God is so much higher than us. And I know that all things eventually come to a climax in him. God is the ultimate source of everything, and it all concludes with him. So all this that we're struggling with now, all that we're going through, all the temporary stuff in this world, Paul's really saying it's going to end one day with him. He made all this. He sustained all. He's controlling all this. And one day he's going to conclude. He's going to climax all this in this great, glorious glorification process. When the church is redeemed and pulled up to glory, the Jews are restored to fellowship with God, and they get an opportunity to be saved, which matter of fact, I think many of them will during the tribulation. So you got 144,000 witnesses out there witnessing to the Jewish people. I think there's going to be a great revival among the Jewish people. And then God is going to institute this millennial reign. and give us peace for 1,000 years. Then he's going to defeat Satan once and for all, cast him away forever into the lake of fire, and then you and I reign in, or not reign, but serve in heaven forever. That's beautiful. That's a beautiful culmination of all this stuff. And Paul said, that brings me a lot of joy. Now what he's going to do is he's going to tell us where the rubber's going to meet the road. Because when we start chapter 12, it moves into the next phase. This ends the glorification section, this end time thing. And it's been a lot of theology and a lot of eschatology and a lot of this stuff. Chapter 12, he brings it back down real personal. It begins a consecration section. And when we start chapter 12, he's going to say, because you know all this, because you know what God has done for you, because you know that he has saved you by grace, that he has given you this, he's grafted you in, he's got a home for you in it, because you know all this, here's what you need to do. Consecrate yourself. Consecrate's a fancy word to mean to set yourself apart for service. And he's going to say, here's how you set yourself apart for service. And you know the opening verses of chapter 12, and we'll talk about them next week, or 2 weeks from now, but look at the opening verse. Because you know all this stuff, therefore. What's the therefore? The therefore is there to link it back to what he's already said. Because you know about God's grace, you know about God's mercy. Therefore, I urge you, brethren. I'm urging you, I'm begging, I'm pleading with you by the mercies of God to present your bodies a living sacrifice, which is your reasonable and acceptable service. He said, because you know what God has done for you, because you know all this stuff, I'm begging you now, I'm pleading with you now to give yourself back to the Lord. And when we look at this, we're not going to meet next Wednesday? Yeah, next Wednesday. We're not going to meet next Wednesday, and we won't meet the next Wednesday. I think it's 2 Wednesdays in a row. So the next time we come back, we're going to look at this, and here's what you're going to see in verse 1. In verse 1, there's actually 4 commitments that Paul's asking you to do. There's 4 things he's saying, because you know all that God has done for you. This is what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to. And he says it's not your extraordinary service. It's not something that God has no right to ask of you. He said it's reasonable. It's a reasonable service to do this. And so we'll pick up with chapter 12 then. Any questions about chapter 11? It won't be, chapter 12 through the rest of the book is not as deep theologically. It's not as hard to swallow as some parts of it have been previously. It's more practical. Any questions? All right, we appreciate all you being here and appreciate you being online. We'll sign off with